Hello. It's a real treat to be here and be invited to speak with this crew. I was fortunate enough 2015, 2016 to come and live and work here, live in the area and work at Nueva. And so it's a real treat to get to do this with you. And since the theme today is cultivating curiosity, I thought I'd attempt to cultivate some curiosity with you guys about words. And I'll start with a statement that may seem a little bit odd. We're going to try this. We're going to make spelling joyful, and we're going to do it through scientific inquiry. Both of those statements might seem a little bit odd. And if there was a subtitle of this talk, it might be Science and the Joy of Falsification. So let's take a look. We have some historical examples of falsification in science that are quite useful. You may have heard of Ptolemy's geocentric model, which is, when he was working, he was actually an amazing scientist, and he was describing the way the stars and planets worked by thinking that everything revolved around the sun. And he did amazing stuff where he could actually calculate like when eclipses would come and things. It was quite amazing. However, there were these wandering planets. Now, people had noticed these well before Ptolemy, but actually that's where the word planet comes from. It's the Greek word for to wander. And the idea is when you looked at the stars, you see all these lights in the sky. There were certain lights that didn't move with the rest of them, and that's why they called them planets, because they were wandering. But when people tried to use Ptolemy's models that were really spectacular, there was a couple of problems. There was certain planets that seemed to go backwards in ways that just wouldn't be possible. And that's where scientists should dig, where there's contradictions in understanding things. So this is where Copernicus comes in, and he takes a look at this, and he's just not willing to just shove under the rug these planets going backwards. So he has to have some curiosity and ability to imagine, wait a second, there's got to be a reason that this keeps happening. So he stood back and said, well, wait a minute, what if Earth is at the center? What if the sun was the center? And then he had to test that hypothesis, and when he did that, it turned out planets stopped going backwards. Now, he didn't solve everything, because actually our universe isn't all around our sun, but he was able to explain what the data that they could see at the time. So a question to ask ourselves is, what enables a scientist like Copernicus to totally revolutionize how we understand our world? What is it that he was able to do? Well, one thing I would say is at the center of that is this idea of the joy of falsification. This idea that if I see the evidence that what I thought the world is like isn't true, I don't get sad, I get excited, because that means there's something to learn. And so today's question, or perhaps our quest, is a scientific journey that reveals the joy of understanding English spelling. So it turns out this isn't a new idea, that English spelling makes sense. And in fact, very famous linguists, Noam Chomsky, Morris Haley, they already described English orthography as near optimal way back in 1968. But what is this word orthography? Well, it's a scientific word, a linguist's word for spelling. If we want to kind of act like a scientist, and we could take that word orthography, put it on a slide under our microscope and kind of look closely, we can actually look at the structures of the word. And what I'm showing you here are the morphological structures, the bases, the affixes. And if we look at this structure, and we actually look even below that, we can look at the history from where those structures came from. And we see that the first element, the O-R-T-H, is from Greek, and it was from a word that meant straight, true, correct, regular. And then the other base in this word is the G-R-A-P-H, but it came from Greek for graphos, for writing or mark. So once we've looked at something like that, we can now kind of carry that knowledge around in our head. So when you see orthography, not only do we know it's the spelling system, but we know the word itself already tells us that it's well organized, it's reliable, it's a straight organized system. Now, I'm going to show you a model here of orthography from the person I learned this work from, a character who has a real spelling reference that you can check out. And he talks about orthography representing meaning in writing, which is not a new idea, but there's a nice model that reveals this, and this idea that human thought made visible as text. The idea that orthography is making human thought visible is quite a powerful notion. But here's another linguist, Richard Vinetsky, who he describes it this way, and I'll use his description to explain the model. So he says English orthography is not a failed phonetic transcription system invented out of madness or perversity. Instead, it's a more complex system which preserves history in the form of etymology. That's one of the pieces of the model, the history of words. It also facilitates understanding. Well, the morphology, those bases, prefix, and suffix that we talked about, those are the meaning-bearing units in words, and that recognizing those helps facilitate understanding and also translates into sound, the phonology piece. So in linguistics, this is the best current understanding. It's not a controversial one. This is totally well understood. In schools, however, it turns out we often work on the understanding that English spelling represents sounds, but it has many exceptions. So we notice a contradiction. Linguists is telling it's not a failed phonetic transcription system, but that's kind of what we're treating it like in schools. And as we noticed, contradictions is a good place for scientists to dig. So here's some words that are typically presented as irregular words that are frustrating because you have to memorize them because they sound the same, they should be spelled the same. It turns out, though, linguists understand exactly what's going on, and that is with words like this help reveal the concept of the homophone principle. And the homophone principle is that wherever two words can be pronounced the same, wherever possible, they'll be spelled differently to signal that difference. So it's a good thing that these three words pronounced to have different spellings. It's not a bug, it's a feature. This W in the word to is particularly interesting. In schools, you might think of it as particularly frustrating, but actually that's where the joy is. That's where the thing is to discover. Because if you look at that W and you think of related words that mean two things, you might think of words like these. And this W that is causing us frustration is causing us frustration because we're thinking that letters are supposed to write sounds. This letter is actually not even a grapheme. It's not there for pronunciation in the word to. It's there as a marker, an etymological marker linking to related words. Here's another one that is called irregular because it's not what we would expect. But you might be thinking about homophone principles and realize there's another one. And if we look at these words, we can start to see, it makes sense that this one has the W, it's related to the word win. And if we look at these words, one, lone, alone, we can see, the spelling system has found a way to link meaningfully related words. This is a thing, an aspect of a writing system that's described as synchronic etymology. Here we see the CHRON part of this spelling is for time. The SYN is for, these are spellings that have been affected by how they evolved together during time. So as the spelling system is evolving, spellings that best fit to link meaning are what we have. And if you're interested more in that, there's a TED talk I highly recommend you check out that goes into detail in that story. Now, here's another word that I see all the time in schools, and people talk about silent Ks, and you have to memorize it. But of course, if you're a scientist and you see a word and you're surprised to see the letter K, well, maybe we could look and see if there's another answer. Well, there's actually turns out to be a KN that writes that makes sense. And in fact, it's not even that uncommon. Tons of KNs. It's not a silent K. It's just any more than this C is a silent C. And the K is writing K. It's just, that's a CK, that's a KN. No worries. But it turns out it's a good thing we have more ways to write because that helps us separate the words no and no. Again, the homophone principle is just everywhere. Now, this is a different kind of etymology. We can see here, these words, if you take a look at those words, you might start to notice something about their character. And if you dig into dictionaries, you'll find out they're all from Old English. And that is this diachronic through time connections that we can find. There's all sorts of these. PH for F is a sign of Greek. CH for K is a sign of Greek. KN for N is a sign of Old English. Now, if we take this, there's another idea that we need to understand that's crucial to understand spelling, and that is something that linguists call morphemic consistency. When we see this word know, and we build the word knowledge, you might notice something. The spelling of the base is consistent, but the pronunciation is not. In the word know, I say no. In the word knowledge, I say no. But the spelling doesn't change just because the pronunciation has, because it's meaning that is represented consistently, not the pronunciation. And we could even collect, this is called a matrix, where you take a base, a family of words that share a base element, and we can see unknown, knowing, knowable, but as soon as we get to here, all of a sudden that pronunciation changes. And now we understand why it's still spelled with a K-N-O-W. So look at all these words that we typically have been trained to think are irregular things we got to memorize. Of course, no and no make sense. We saw all these homophone principles. That W all of a sudden makes sense when we think about twice and that. Look at all these words that we are told we just have to memorize because they're not understandable. They're often called sight words. Well, why did we assume that these and countless others are irregular? Well, here's my suggestion to you. This idea that we talk about a lot in schools and in the research is this idea of the alphabetic principle, the idea that the primary job of spelling is to represent the sounds of words and the letters represent the sounds. It's a totally logical hypothesis, except we start to have these exceptions. But there's not really a scientific word for exception. We don't say exceptions in science. Exceptions we should be treating as falsification. When we try to explain a set of data and our hypothesis of how the thing works doesn't explain all the data, we don't get to blame the data that isn't doing what we want it to be an exception. We should actually not be sad either. We should be excited and have a party because, whoo, we're about to think something that's not true. Thank gosh I have a reason to stop and think about something else. And so we falsified the hypothesis, which is the first step in seeking a better description. And here's another hypothesis that all of the words we were looking at, they seem to be pointing towards a different hypothesis, the idea that the primary job of spelling is to represent the meaning of words. It turns out that's not even a hypothesis. It's a well-established theory in linguistics. It's not even controversial. So let's come back to the story a little bit. If we start with the alphabetic principle, A is for apple, S is for snake, Z is for zoo, it's a very logical way to look at things from the start. It's kind of like akin to Ptolemy. Of course, if you're standing on the planet and you look up in the skies and you see the stars moving, the logical assumption is, well, they must be moving around us because I don't feel like I'm moving. But what happens is that is treating sound as the center of gravity. If we talk about spelling now, it looks like it's obvious that the letters are there to write sounds. But when you look closer, we find out there's some wandering planets in their spelling system. These exceptions are the things that is where the interesting bits are. All those homophones are wandering planets. Here, two, and there's tons of homophones. If the alphabetic principle were true, homophones would have to be spelled the same. And in fact, the principle is they're not. And then we saw this morphemic consistency idea. Well, we saw with know and knowledge that it wasn't the pronunciation that was preserved in the spelling, it was the meaning element. And that's everywhere. The word do and does is not weird. It's just got a do base and an es suffix. It's just that the spelling of the element is consistent, not the pronunciation. And act, if we add an ion, we suddenly have action. So the base in action is pronounced act. Is pronounced action. But we now can learn that the T turns out can write sh, something that we don't usually think about in schools. So what if we act a little bit like Copernicus and say, wait a second, this was not a bad first hypothesis, but we got to stop ignoring these exceptions and recognize that they're trying to they are falsifying the hypothesis, so we should look for something else. And what the idea that the writing system is actually showing us, it's not that sound is the center of gravity of the spelling system, but meaning is. And if we start to do that, we can model how it works. Now, what can we do with that knowledge? What could happen if we start investigating English spelling as a well-ordered system? So, if we look here, we have this word investigating. If I put that under the microscope, it turns out it was a 10-year-old dyslexic kid who showed me that the word vestige is at the base of the word investigating. And that history goes back to this idea of footprint trace. So we're investigating things, we're following the footprint or the trace of things. When I was at Nueva, I got to work in the grade 1 class, and they were introducing journal writing. And they asked me to investigate that word. Well, I just looked at the word journal and noticed, hey, journal, I wonder if journey's related. And so I looked at the history, and it turns out this goes back to day, like soup du jour. And so a journalist is writing about the journeys through the day. And then I was in a high school class just right there. And there was an amazing class that was studying this speech by Obama, the eulogy for Reverend Pinckney, which under this horrible story that happened. And this was a statement in that speech that we were looking at. And when I looked at it, I noticed that word subjugation, and I thought, something's interesting there. So I dug in, I went to the etymology, and I found that word subjugate, and it went back to this root for bring under the yoke. So the idea of subjugating somebody is literally treating them like animals and putting them under the yoke. And then I found the actual deeper root, and I looked it up. And when I looked up that word, I found it took me to jugular. So not only is subjugating people about putting them under the yoke, it's like standing on their jugular. And what I told the kids is, I don't know if the speechwriter had awareness of that, but now that we do, if you are going to write about subjugation, you can plant the word yoke, plant the word jugular nearby to get more force to your writing. If you're interested in following that story, Matt Berman's website I have a video up there describing it. But perhaps, since we're in curiosity, we should look at that word itself. Well, if you look at the history of that word, it comes from a Latin root for cure. And when I looked at that up, I see care, concern, study, and I made this matrix. And you notice that we have curiosity and curious and accuracy. Accurate. If you're accurate, you care about having the real story. And I got that from a matrix from Gina Cook's Lex website. Now look how far she's taken it. I give you a pared down version first. And I recommend you take a closer look later, but we can see that word hiding in there. And she said it in conjunction with a statement that I thought was quite interesting, where she said, I recently encountered the suggestion that arguments may be avoided when people approach each other with curiosity. To be curious about someone else, their thoughts or motivations, is to care about them. So perhaps it's time to care more about spelling. So science encourages us to question our long-held assumptions. That's the whole point. So if we have the heart to investigate spelling as a reliable system, with meaning as the center of gravity, we just might understand the joy of spelling. So I will end her there. And that was just after the 1 minute sign.